Greetings and welcome to the second class, The Dharma of James Baldwin and Audre Lorde. I first want to start off with a kind of explanation of the meaning of suffering in the Buddhist tradition, a term known as dukkha. And I talked a little bit about this last class. I'll talk a little bit about this meaning of dukkha, which is sometimes translated as the painful, and it refers to physical and mental pain. Human beings seek what the Buddha called the three forms of thirst. The first is sensual pleasure. The second is ego-driven protection. And the third is aversion to unpleasantness. The Buddhist studies scholar Peter Harvey says, and this is a direct quote from him, that Buddhism teaches that transcending the stress of life requires a fully realistic assessment of its pervasive presence, which is another way of saying that transcending stress requires acknowledging suffering. If we ignore the painful aspects of our existence, we become attached. But if we acknowledge the painful aspects of our existence, we can be liberated. I'm really speaking about the early Buddhist tradition in this Dharma talk. The early Buddhist suttas suggest that there are twofold aspects to the nature of pain. There's conditioned phenomena that is by nature painful. So think of poverty and violence that lead to physical and mental pain. And then there's reacting to a situation with grasping or with aversion or avoiding that results in pain. This is important because we have James Baldwin and Audre Lorde as our guides to help us understand the nuances of suffering, of these teachings that were given to us 2,600 years ago. So importantly for us, with our luminaries, they discuss the nature of suffering using their personal life experiences. And they illuminate not only the human condition, but also the conditions, our society, in which we find ourselves. I find this so important as we discuss the nuances of suffering, how these conditions fuel a very particular kind of suffering, particularly for people of African descent whose ancestors were brought here in chains. Baldwin and Lorde illuminate for us also many aspects of mental afflictions that arise out of these particular conditions. And they teach us that it is important to pay attention to those conditions. Even as they recognize the nuances of their mental afflictions, for Baldwin and Lorde, as for the Buddha, I see, and I would say in my own practice, the truth of suffering is a truth to be known intimately, to be turned to be parsed, to be elaborated. And this is what we'll do in our study today. So what are these particular acute manifestations of suffering for James Baldwin? He talked about navigating superficial constructs of Blackness in society. He was highly critical of any portrayal of Black people that depended upon whiteness. For Baldwin, who was highly critical of his early mentor, Richard Wright, and a book, Native Son, which is a classic for many of us, Baldwin thinks that Wright does a profound disservice to Black people in his superficial portrayal of a character, particularly the main character who's known as Bigger. And this is because, Baldwin says, rather than stating that Black people are solely the product of their conditions, Baldwin yearns for characters that penetrate the experiences of love and hatred. He wants to move past Blackness and whiteness, these dichotomies, to look at what it means to be fully human. This is important because Baldwin is addressing a kind of construct of Blackness as evil, this construct that pervades white society. He has this beautiful essay, Stranger in the Village, in one of his earliest books. And in this essay, he writes about what it feels like to be considered hellbound or beyond salvation. So for Baldwin, a mental affliction, you could say a source of suffering, is to not be considered fully human, to not be taken on one's own terms, to not be able to be fully known. And in this essay, Stranger in the Village, he talks about being compared to white men. And this is a quote from him. He says, "I, without a thought of conquest, find myself among a people who have cost me more in anguish and rage than they will ever know, who yet do not even know of my existence." Baldwin further writes, "The black man insists, by whatever means he finds at his disposal, that the white man cease to regard him as an exotic rarity," he says, "and recognize him," meaning the black man, "as a human being." That's one aspect of mental affliction. For Baldwin, another is the denial of our humanity that fuels internalized racism. In another essay he writes called Many Thousands Gone, he talks about being forced to constantly contend with white fear, a kind of white fear that fosters the social construct of the quote-unquote Negro, the threatening, violent black man, the passive, careful person. In that essay, Baldwin writes, and this is, again, a direct quote, that the American image of the Negro lives also in the Negro's heart. Baldwin says, and when he, the black person, the Negro, has surrendered this image, life has no other possible reality. Baldwin did an interview with David Estes, and in this interview he says the great battle was to not interiorize the world's condemnation, to not see yourself as the world saw you. For Baldwin, this was lifelong, and he links this to disavowing identity. There is much in Buddhism that teaches us that we must not cling to identity, that if we do so, in fact, we perpetuate a source of suffering. But for Baldwin, this is true for Audre Lorde, whose parents were immigrants, the dislocation and the ramification of the transatlantic slave trade and the particular experiences of being racialized as Black in the United States, that these sources of suffering in relation to identity is more nuanced. And I want us to really turn towards that for Baldwin, suffering is disavowing identity, that it is linked to survival, that claiming our identities as American or living into survival by turning towards, this is a Baldwin's language, his peculiar status in the Western world to his own advantage. This is a quote from Stranger in the Village. For Baldwin, if we disavow our identities as Black, we are disconnected from our ancestors, and therefore we cannot feel that sense of inner authority or security that arises from the cultural honoring of our ancestors. So for Baldwin, the fact of the action block of being severed from ancestral connection, he talks about this in Stranger in the Village, that these are sources of suffering, of mental suffering. And they lead to internalized racism. They lead to a sense of being trapped and immobilized. He speaks of being so trapped in the American image of the Negro, in this idea of who the Black man is, the American impulse to always find a ray of hope. He describes this as immobilizing, a kind of inability to find a way forward, that this is a kind of psychological oppression. He says, again in this interview with David Estes, as he talks about the Atlanta child murders, that for me to write the book, about the Atlanta child murders was simply putting blinders on a horse. On either side was the trap of rage or the trap of sorrow. So, in other words, for Baldwin to write, to acknowledge what is happening, is to find a way out of being trapped. He says later that despair is the American crime. So one is trapped in a kind of purgatory, a kind of Sunday purgatory. And the only way out of that, he says, is to confront what you are afraid of. This is very powerful for Baldwin, to confront our suffering, confront our rage at being subjected to the power of white men. He said rage can only with difficulty, but never entirely, be brought under the dominion of the intelligence, which is to say rational thinking. He says, and therefore it is not susceptible to any arguments whatever. Here we are getting Baldwin. For Baldwin, this essence of the creative life and the spiritual life. But rage cannot be hidden. It can only be disassembled. Baldwin says that no Black man can never, ever entirely be liberated from this internal warfare. He refers to rage as warfare, this kind of disassembling, this contempt for having inevitably accompanied his first realization of the power of the white men. For Baldwin, then, this rage, which is its own form of suffering, must be known fully. And I appreciate that we can honor that for Baldwin, suffering arises from a process of avoiding, that actually suffering is compounded by avoiding, or a kind of habit of evading what is true. So turning towards our rage, turning towards our practice of disassembling, Baldwin says we are always in this temptation to invent, which is the same thing as the temptation to evade. I think this is a very powerful analysis. He's saying that suffering takes place when we are so trapped in fear that we continuously act out of it. It is not about the experience of terror or even rage. Suffering for Baldwin is instead a kind of repression, a rejection of these forces. It's a kind of inability or an incapacity to acknowledge and validate the true feelings that threaten to consume us. These are feelings that are deeply terrifying. And he argues that white people avoid their suffering, that they project it onto Black people. He identifies this, in fact, in the hopes and dreams of myopic white liberals who look only to their goodwill, to their aspirations, but not to self-interrogation, or, he says, in their complicity and the degradation of Black people. He comes down fiercely. He says white liberals' assumption was that Black men were to become truly human, and what that frankly means is that they must first become like white liberals. But Baldwin rejects this completely. For Baldwin, the desire of white people, liberals, and every political inclination is to be seen and not judged. And he says that creates for them a profound tension and anguish that prevents the capacity for love. He said of themselves, he said, and of Black people as well. He says that white people demonstrate an inability to admit to, quote unquote, human weight and complexity, end of quote. He wrote that in Stranger in the Village. He said, suffering is refusing to live in reality, and that the American vision of the world, he says, is dangerously inaccurate and perfectly useless, for it protects our moral high-mindedness, he says, at the terrible expense of weakening our grasp of reality. I think this is so important to absorb. He says people who shut their eyes to reality simply invite their own destruction. And anyone who insists on remaining in a state of innocence, long after that innocence is dead, he says, turns himself into a monster. That is one of Baldwin's most famous quotes. You'll find it all over the internet. And it's because he is dismissive of people who avoid suffering. He has another beautiful essay, The Artist's Struggle for Integrity, that's really actually a speech. He says, Americans are totally unlettered in the language of the heart, totally distrustful of what cannot be touched. He says Americans are panic-stricken at the very thought, the very first hint of pain. But he says at the same time, a people who are determined to believe that they can make suffering obsolete. He said, who don't understand yet a very physiological fact. He says that the pain which signals a toothache is a pain which saves your life. He says this is very frightening. So we see for Baldwin over and over a claiming of suffering as useful and avoidance as useless. And at the same time, suffering provides a way to connect to others. In this same speech, The Artist's Struggle for Integrity, Baldwin says that everyone suffers, but what is most important is that personal suffering is used as a way to connect to others. And we see this perspective too in Audre Lorde's reflections. This is where I hear them mirror one another in such distinct ways. The experience of suffering, Audre Lorde says, leads to inner authority. Baldwin's admiration for tenacity and courage is evident. He speaks again and again of the love for Black people, for their capacity for survival amidst horrors. He talks about Black life in white America and what it means physically and mentally. Baldwin loved Bessie Smith, and when he moved to France, he listened to the blues and he heard the voices of Black suffering, of Black pain in a very new way. He wrote later an essay called Sonny's Blues, in which he said, drowning in deep water are not the same thing. And in my mind, this is where I hear the teachings of suffering in the Buddhist tradition, where faith and trustful confidence are part of the Buddhist parlance. I hear parallels in Baldwin and Lorde as well, this kind of embracing of suffering and a refusing to avoid, this insistence upon being a complex human being, kind of identifying suffering as something from which we can learn. Suffering is useful. And in that way, pain is also a way to connect to other people, to develop the capacity for empathy and for clear seeing. And I want to turn now to how Audre Lorde distinctly talked about suffering. So she too thought of pain and suffering as instructive. She used the word useful over and over. These are experiences to be known. She writes about the experience of a window falling on her arm and learning these teachings. She uses the words evasion, but also transcendence of pain. And she talks about how there are two sides to a drug that is meant to numb us. She says it relieves us of pain because we can neither anticipate nor remember. She says, but by the same token, this drug is such that we cannot learn from our pain. It does not inform our mind. So for Audre Lorde, it's one thing to talk about feelings, including pain. She says, but it's another thing to really allow ourselves to feel. She says, love is often pain, but I think about what is really necessary. And she says, it's to see how much of this pain I can use, how much of this truth I can see, she says, and still live unblinded. For Audre Lorde, suffering gives us a kind of perspective on life. that we must not be afraid of pain, she says. And that's a direct quote. She says we should not subject ourselves to pain as an end in itself. She says we must not celebrate victimization because there are other ways of being Black. She says, and this is her voice, I find that I must remember that the pain is not its own reason for being. She says it is a part of living. And the only kind of pain, she says, that is intolerable is a pain that is wasteful, a pain from which we do not learn. She says, and I think that we must remember, we must learn to distinguish between the two. I take heart with the ways in which Audre Lorde sees suffering as something that helps us understand our capacity to make choices. When she talked about the window falling on her arm, she said there are choices to die or to tolerate this pain, to bear it. But what does bearing mean, she asks. She says it means changing or going through. She says suffering teaches us about impermanence so that the pain can be transformed. She talks about how the intensity changes, that it has to stop or it has to change. This was a physical knowledge that she experienced, she said, and this was a useful lesson that she had not had before. She says pain has a mutability. Pain is fluid. She said it's only when you conceive of it as something static that it is unbearable. So bearing suffering, this is a big term from someone who talked about transformation. But she says the capacity to bear suffering leads to a kind of inner authority and confidence. That because she could bear pain, there was nothing she could not do, nothing she could not deal with. She says because pain will always either change or stop. Always. She says, I have tested this since then, and it is always clear and workable. So bearing suffering doesn't mean you're a doormat. But it does mean we come to inner authority and that we connect to other people, that we also can see ourselves as them, that we can share in victories. She says this is how learning occurs. And when she talks about pain as connecting to other people, she says we must share our mistakes in the same way that we share our victories. She says because that's the only way that learning occurs. She says, in other words, we have survived the pain, the problems, the failures. And so what we need to do is use this suffering and learn from it. That's a direct quote from Audre Lorde. I want to conclude with her words, I choose to be awake. Because for Audre Lorde, this learning from suffering, this learning from pain, this bearing, this refusing to be a doormat and instead seeing the usefulness of pain, the usefulness of suffering as something that leads to a kind of fearlessness is a change in perspective from which we can all learn. And in my own Buddhist practice, this has been most clear and most true. To observe the pain, to watch it, to look at it, to know it for what it is, not to succumb to it, and not to avoid it, but to know that I can bear it. This, for me, is a kind of stamina that makes Buddhism a worthwhile practice, a kind of myriad or complexity of teachings that lead to a kind of inner authority. For me, it has been 20 years of practice, and it is the reason why I stay.